I still get chills when I think about that summer. What started as the best trip of my life turned into something I'll never forget, for all the wrong reasons. It was the summer after I graduated high school, and it felt like my one last chance to live without any real responsibilities. No college stress yet, no job tying me down. Just freedom. My closest friends, Emily, Brian, and Tyler, were in the same mindset. We wanted something big, something memorable, something that would make us feel alive before life got serious. That's when Emily suggested a road trip to a remote lake in Montana. She'd read about this hidden spot deep in the woods, far from towns, tourists, or parents breathing down our necks. It sounded perfect, secluded, quiet, and ours for the weekend. We packed tents, sleeping bags, snacks, and just enough beer to make it feel like a celebration. I couldn't wait. The nights promised warm air, stars overhead, and campfire stories with the people I trusted most. At that point, I was sure it would be the summer I'd look back on forever, though not in the way I expected. We loaded up Emily's old SUV early that morning, cramming the back with gear and snacks until there was barely room left for us. The drive felt like freedom, windows down, music blasting, Brian tossing pretzels into Tyler's mouth from the back seat, all of us laughing harder than we had in months. It was the kind of road trip you imagine when you think of being young, wild, and unstoppable. But as the miles dragged on, the road narrowed into long, winding stretches through thick forest. The deeper we went, the weaker our cell service became until finally, there was nothing, just us and the woods. No backup plan if something went wrong. When we finally reached the lake, it was breathtaking. The water was so still, it looked like glass, reflecting endless rows of pine trees that stretched high into the sky. There was no one else around, not a single sound except our footsteps crunching the gravel. We set up camp by the shore, pitching tents and gathering firewood, trying to keep the excitement alive. But I couldn't shake the feeling that the silence wasn't peaceful at all. It was heavy, almost like the place was waiting for us. That afternoon, after the tents were up and the firewood was stacked, we decided to take a walk around the shoreline. The lake was so still it almost felt unreal, like a giant mirror stretched out in front of us. That's when I saw him. Across the water, maybe 50 yards away, there was an old man standing near the edge of the lake. He wasn't fishing or skipping rocks, he was just standing there, motionless, watching us. At first, I thought maybe he'd wave, or call out, or do something to let us know he wasn't just some creep. But he didn't. He just kept staring. No smile, no nod, nothing. Emily joked that he was probably some local fisherman who didn't like outsiders. Brian laughed nervously, saying, "Hey, at least he's not carrying an axe." We all laughed, but it was the kind of laugh you use to push away a bad feeling. When we went swimming later, I looked back toward that same spot, and he was gone. No sound of footsteps, no boat, no car, just empty shoreline. The only sign he'd even been there were a few damp footprints pressed into the mud, and somehow that felt worse than if he had stayed. By the time the sun slipped behind the trees, the whole place changed. The warm glow of daylight gave way to shadows that stretched long and heavy, and our fire became the only light for miles. We sat in a circle, the flames cracking between us, treating scary stories like little kids at a sleepover. We laughed louder than we needed to, each of us pretending we weren't just a little spooked by the stillness pressing in around us. Then came the sound, branches snapping somewhere in the tree line. Sharp, deliberate. We all froze. Emily was the first to speak, her voice tight but steady. "It's probably just deer," she said, though she didn't sound convinced. Brian leaned forward, his eyes locked on the dark woods. "That wasn't a deer," he whispered. "I swear I saw someone move out there." We laughed again, but it was forced this time, the kind of laugh you use to keep fear from spilling over. Eventually, We crawled into our tents, still tossing out nervous jokes to fill the silence. But when I closed my eyes, all I could see was that old man by the lake, standing perfectly still, staring straight at us. Sometime in the middle of the night, I woke up. At first, I thought it was just the sound of the wind through the trees, but then I realized it was something else, whispering. Low, raspy, broken words drifting just outside the tent. My chest tightened as I slowly unzipped a tiny slit in the flap to peek out. My stomach dropped. The old man was crouched in the dirt where our fire had burned out, running his fingers through the ashes like he was searching for something. His clothes were torn, his hands caked with soil, his lips moving in a steady mumble I couldn't understand. Then, without warning, his head snapped toward me. Our eyes locked. He saw me watching, and he smiled, a wide, unnatural grin that stretched across his face like it didn't belong there. I froze as he reached to his belt and pulled out a long hunting knife. The whispers grew louder, slipping into some kind of chant, harsh and garbled, like words that weren't meant for human mouths. I must have made a noise because Emily stirred. My panicked voice woke the others, and soon they all heard it, the crunch of footsteps circling our tents. Emily screamed when a shadow brushed against her tent wall. Tyler yelled that we had to run, that the SUV was our only chance. But every second we hesitated, those footsteps drew closer, closing us in. We didn't wait any longer. In a blur of panic, we tore out of the tents and bolted for the SUV. The forest exploded with sound, branches snapping, leaves crunching, footsteps pounding somewhere right behind us. My lungs burned as I ran, every part of me convinced that if I slowed even for a second, he'd catch me. Emily reached the car first, shaking so badly she could barely get the keys out of her pocket. We were screaming at her to hurry as the footsteps grew louder. Finally, the locks clicked open, and we threw ourselves inside. The moment the headlights cut through the darkness, my heart nearly stopped. There he was, already standing in front of the SUV, his grin stretched wide, the knife glinting in his hand. We froze. None of us could move. Then, just as suddenly, he dropped the knife into the dirt and turned away. Without a word, he disappeared back into the tree line, swallowed whole by the night. Emily slammed the car into gear, and we sped down the dirt road, adrenaline flooding every vein. I glanced out the rear window, but there was nothing. No man, no shadow, nothing at all. That's when Tyler whispered the truth none of us wanted to face. We'd left everything, our bags, our wallets, our phones, back at the campsite. The car went silent. We argued the whole drive back. Emily wanted to keep going, to never look back. Brian said we had to turn around. We couldn't just leave everything behind. Tyler and I shut him down. None of us were willing to risk seeing that man again. Our stuff wasn't worth our lives. The next day, when we told the police, they agreed to check the campsite. A few hours later, they called us back with something I'll never forget. They said there was nothing there. No bags, no tents, no gear at all. Not even our footprints in the dirt. It was like the campsite had never existed. The only thing they found was a knife buried into the ground where our fire had been. Sometimes I wonder if that old man was even real, or if the lake itself wanted us gone. Either way, I'll never set foot in Montana again. I still can't explain what really happened that summer, but it's the one trip that changed how I look at vacations forever. My name is Emily, and this happened when I was 20 years old. It was the summer right after my sophomore year of college, and 3 of my closest friends, Jason, Kelly, and Matt, and I decided to take a road trip before life got serious again. We didn't want beaches or crowded cities. We wanted something quiet, something different. That's how we ended up renting a cabin in a small rural lake town in the Midwest, a place I had honestly never even heard of before Jason found the listing online. The drive there was full of laughter, bad singing, and junk food. Typical road trip energy. But I remember scrolling through forums about the town on my phone before we lost service, and a few posts stuck with me. People mentioned strange disappearances, locals who didn't welcome outsiders, and one comment that simply said, "Don't stay near Deadwater Lake after dark." When we finally pulled into the town, the first thing I noticed was how quiet everything felt. The cabin was tucked away at the edge of Deadwater Lake, surrounded by tall pines that blocked out most of the sunlight. Online, the pictures had made it look cozy and charming, but in person, it was older, more worn down, like no one had stayed there in years. Jason cracked a joke about it being the perfect place for a horror movie, and everyone laughed, but I couldn't shake this weird feeling in my stomach. Before heading to the cabin, we stopped at the only small store in town to grab snacks and supplies. The second we walked in, I felt eyes on us. A few locals paused what they were doing and just stared, not saying a word. The clerk, an older man with a raspy voice, bagged our things and muttered, "Don't stay out too late by the lake." He said it so casually, but the way his eyes lingered on us made my skin crawl. As we drove off, I couldn't shake the sensation that someone was still watching us from the shadows. That first night at the cabin actually started out perfect. We grilled burgers on the small deck, played music from Jason's speaker, and told dumb stories like we were back in high school again. For a while, it felt like exactly what we had wanted. Just 4 friends, no responsibilities, no stress, just summer freedom. The air smelled like pine and smoke from the grill, and the lake shimmered under the fading Sunday. But as the night got darker, the atmosphere shifted. Every so often, I'd hear splashes coming from the lake, but when I looked, there was nothing. No fish, no birds, no movement at all. Just ripples fading into the black water. Inside the cabin, the lights flickered once or twice, which Jason joked was because of bad country wiring, but it still made me uneasy. At one point, I stepped outside alone, just to breathe. The silence hit me immediately. It wasn't peaceful, it was heavy, like the whole forest was holding its breath. Then, across the lake, a single light blinked 3 times. A flashlight maybe, or something else? I rushed back inside to tell everyone, but they just laughed it off. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that it wasn't random, that someone out there was signaling. The next morning, we decided to explore the little town. At first glance, it just looked old and run down, but the longer we walked, the more unsettling it became. Half the shops were boarded up, paint peeling from their windows. On a bulletin board near the post office, I noticed something that made my stomach tighten. 2 missing person posters, both recent, both young people who looked not much older than us. I didn't say anything to the others, but in that moment, I felt this creeping certainty. We didn't belong here. Later, we took the rowboat the cabin came with and paddled out onto the lake. The water was calm, almost too calm, until something massive thudded against the bottom of the boat. It wasn't a log, I could feel it move beneath us. Everyone laughed nervously, but I couldn't hide the dread crawling up my spine. When we got back to the cabin, I froze. The front door was cracked open. Jason swore he'd locked it, and we all knew he had. Inside, the air felt colder. On the wooden floor, leading straight toward the bedrooms, were small, muddy footprints, like a child's. But we were alone. At least, we thought we were. That night, things went from strange to terrifying. After dinner, Jason stepped outside to make a call. He said he needed some air and wanted to see if his phone would pick up a signal by the dock. We barely noticed at first, but after 15 minutes passed, Kelly asked where he was. When we went outside to look, he was gone. We grabbed flashlights and split up, calling his name into the woods. Every sound echoed back at us, twigs snapping, branches shifting, but no answer. Then, faintly, I swear I heard a scream. Not loud, but distant, muffled, almost swallowed by the trees. My chest tightened as I swung my flashlight toward the tree line and saw them, shapes, maybe 2 or 3, standing just beyond the beam of light. They didn't move. They just watched. Panicked, we rushed back to the cabin. Phones were useless, no service at all. That's when the power cut out, plunging everything into darkness. The silence was broken by faint scratching along the cabin walls, circling us, dragging nails against the wood. We shoved furniture against the doors, breathing hard, whispering Jason's name. Then Kelly pointed, her hand shaking. At the edge of the dock, barely visible in the moonlight, lay Jason's phone. The screen was still glowing, but Jason was gone. Just when we thought the scratching was about to break through the walls, a sudden pounding rattled the front door. We froze, certain it was them. But then a man's voice shouted, urgent and rough, "Open up, now! You need to leave this place!" Matt cracked the door, holding a chair like a weapon, and an older man in a worn jacket pushed inside. His face was pale, eyes wide with fear. He didn't waste time. "They take people who stay too long by the lake," he said, almost whispering. "If you want to live, you leave, tonight." None of us wanted to believe him, but something in his voice, raw and desperate, made us move. We grabbed our bags, threw them into the car, and sped down the dirt road without looking back. As we passed the lake, headlights cut across the dock. That's when we saw them. A line of flashlights, perfectly in sync, moving slowly back and forth like a silent patrol. A group, waiting, watching. No one spoke as we tore away from Deadwater Lake, our hearts pounding, terrified of what would have happened if we had stayed one more night. Jason was never found. The police filed a report, but their explanation was almost insulting. They said he must have fallen into the lake and been carried off by the currents, or maybe he just decided to run away. But I was there. I saw those figures in the trees, heard the scratching at the walls. Whatever took Jason, it wasn't natural. For weeks afterward, I tried to push it out of my head, telling myself it was just trauma, just fear, playing tricks. But then, late one night, my phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. Just 3 words, "We saw you." My stomach dropped, and I knew then that Jason hadn't been some random accident. We were being watched the whole time. And sometimes, when I close my eyes at night, I still see that line of flashlights on the dock, waiting, patient, like they're not finished yet. Some trips stay with you for a lifetime, not because of the good memories, but because of the ones you wish you could forget. This happened 5 years ago, during what was supposed to be the perfect summer vacation. I was 23 at the time, fresh out of college, and still trying to figure out what to do with my life. My best friend Ethan had just bought a beat-up old car, and my girlfriend Rachel was excited to get away from her summer job for a while. None of us had much money, so instead of flying anywhere fancy, we decided to plan a cheap road trip to a quiet lakeside town in upstate New York. It sounded peaceful, adventurous, and, most importantly, affordable. Looking back now, I sometimes wish we'd never gone. What started out as a light-hearted escape quickly turned into a memory that still keeps me awake at night. When we finally pulled into the little lakeside town, it felt like stepping into another world. The streets were nearly empty. The few people we passed just stood on their porches, staring in that way that makes you instantly aware you don't belong. We followed the directions from Craigslist until we reached the cabin we'd rented, and right away I knew the photos had lied. The place looked older, more worn down, with shutters hanging crooked and steps that groaned under our weight. Inside, the air smelled of dust and damp wood. The floors creaked with every step, and cobwebs hung in the corners like no one had lived there in years. The lake itself looked beautiful, calm and glassy, but strangely deserted. No swimmers, no boats, not even fishermen. Rachel whispered that something felt off, but Ethan just laughed. Before leaving, the caretaker muttered one thing: "Don't stay out after dark." That first night actually started out kind of fun. We built a small fire out back, roasted marshmallows, and passed around a 6-pack of cheap beer Ethan had picked up on the way. For a little while, it felt like the road trip we'd been dreaming of, laughing, telling old stories, just being carefree. But as the night went on, little things started to creep in. I kept hearing splashes out on the lake, like someone had thrown a rock into the water, but whenever I looked, the surface was perfectly still. At one point, I caught myself glancing toward the trees, certain someone was watching us. Ethan noticed and teased me for being paranoid, which only made Rachel speak up. She admitted she didn't feel safe here, that the caretaker's face had looked almost too relieved when he handed us the keys and left. I laughed it off, but deep down, I felt the same. The next day we tried to make the best of it. We wandered through town, but it was impossible to ignore how strange people acted around us. Locals avoided eye contact, some even crossing the street when they saw us. A few whispered as we passed, but when I glanced back, they'd quickly look away. It left this heavy, uncomfortable feeling in the pit of my stomach. By evening, Ethan was determined to finally use the lake. The sun was just starting to dip, painting the water orange and gold, and he stripped down to his shorts, daring us to join him. Rachel hesitated, but eventually I followed. The water was colder than I expected, but what really got me was the way it felt, like something was moving beneath us. At one point, I swear I saw shapes standing far below, darker shadows against the murky bottom. Then Rachel screamed. She swore she saw hands reaching up through the water. Panic hit, and we bolted for the shore. My legs felt heavy, like something brushed against me, tugging for just a second before letting go. We collapsed onto the sand, gasping. Ethan laughed it off as weeds, but I knew what I felt. And it wasn't weeds. That night was when everything shifted. We were sitting inside playing cards when I heard it, faint scratching along the outside wall, slow and deliberate, like nails dragging against the wood. At first I thought it was an animal, but then came the whispering, low, hushed voices drifting through the dark. Rachel froze, staring at the window. She swore she saw someone walk past, just a shadow moving across the glass. We grabbed a flashlight and opened the door, but no one was there. What we did find were muddy footprints smeared across the porch, bare feet, leading right up to the door and then stopping. My stomach dropped. Ethan forced a laugh, saying it was probably kids messing around, but I noticed his hands shaking as he quietly locked every door and window. The tension grew heavier by the minute. Rachel begged us to pack up and leave before anything else happened, but Ethan refused, saying we were just being paranoid. I sat there, caught between them, my own mind racing. I wanted to believe Ethan, but deep down, I couldn't shake the feeling that we weren't alone out here, and that someone was waiting for us to let our guard down. The third night was pure hell. It started with a single bang against the wall, so loud it rattled the glasses in the cupboard. Then another, and another. Within seconds, the entire cabin shook as if something was trying to tear it apart. The doors rattled on their hinges, the windows trembled, and outside we could hear voices, low, guttural chanting, like a language I couldn't understand. Rachel screamed, clutching my arm, shouting, "They're coming from the lake!" I forced myself to look out the window, and what I saw nearly stopped my heart. A line of figures stood at the tree line, pale, dripping wet, their skin grey and stretched tight over bone. Their faces were blank, except for their mouths, wide open, far too wide, water pouring from them as they began to move in perfect unison toward the cabin. The lights flickered violently, plunging us in and out of darkness. I grabbed Rachel's hand, screaming at Ethan to move, but he hesitated, frozen. In the chaos, the window beside him shattered, and unseen hands reached in, yanking him out in one brutal motion, his scream cut short, swallowed by the night. Terrified, Rachel and I bolted, sprinting blindly into the forest as the chanting grew louder behind us. We ran, until our lungs felt like they were tearing apart, crashing through branches and stumbling over roots, too scared to look back. Finally, the trees broke, and we stumbled into the town square, lit only by a few flickering street lamps. Desperate, we pounded on the door of a small cafe until a man reluctantly let us in. The warmth should have felt comforting, but the faces staring back at us were anything but. The locals looked grim, almost unsurprised, like they had been waiting for this moment. An older man shook his head and muttered, "The lake takes who it wants. You were lucky to get away." Before I could even process his words, Rachel clutched my arm, eyes wide with terror. She swore she heard Ethan's voice calling from the edge of the woods, clear, desperate, begging for help. The locals refused to move, whispering, "Once it calls you, it's not him anymore." Even now, years later, I can't escape that night. I still dream about Ethan's scream, how suddenly it ended, how helpless I felt as he was ripped away from us. Sometimes I wake up drenched in sweat, convinced I can hear it echoing through the dark. A few weeks after we got home, my phone rang in the middle of the night. I nearly dropped it when I saw the caller ID, Ethan's number. Against every instinct, I answered. What I heard wasn't his voice, not really. It was wet, broken, gurgling, like words bubbling up through water. Just one sentence. "Why did you leave me in the lake?" The line went dead. No one picked up when I called back. Some nights, when it rains, I swear I hear splashing outside my window, and I wonder if Ethan ever really left the lake, or if he's still waiting for me.